proud to affirm and resolve the United States should accede to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court, or the ICC, has been a pillar of accountability and moral relief to the international community for decades. 420 finds that many sought to disentangle the impact of the ICC, each using different data and methodology, but they all independently came to the same conclusion. The ICC does prevent violence. The available empirical studies suggest that the ICC shortens ongoing conflicts and prevents conflicts from occurring. However, failure of the U.S. to accede to the Rome Statute and support the ICC has prevented it from expanding its reach globally. Our first argument concerns legitimacy. The ICC is only as strong as the members it is composed of. So Article 21 explains, the court is completely dependent on state cooperation. This has been a major weakness. There needs to be active engagement. Unfortunately, Statute 20 finds that lack of U.S. support has jeopardized the ability of countries to cooperate with the court, which erodes the court's legitimacy. Article 21 reasons that ICC's deterrence potential is influenced by the level of international support from states. As a result, Seawall solidifies that ICC's legitimacy, capabilities, and effectiveness will hinge on the policies of the United States. A legit ICC can save lives and stop genocide. Article 21 counters common misconceptions, explaining that expectations toward the court are often too high. The ICC had a clear effect, with a threefold decrease in civilian fatalities. Continued support for a well-backed ICC has the potential to save many lives. Second is sanctions. Currently, the U.S. has deeply sanctioned the ICC. Edwards last week reports that the U.S. signed an executive order placing economic and travel sanctions on the ICC. Link 24 further that threats of sanctions against the ICC are prohibited, condemning threats by the U.S., and all states should refrain from such threats. And as a member state, the United States would no longer have the capacity or incentive to sanction the ICC. This is imperative. Anderson from January finds that U.S. sanctions in the ICC disable the institution. All assets in U.S. dollars are frozen, which are 90% of global transactions, and this financial institution's cut off relationships, which threatens its very existence. This would be catastrophic, as ASIN from January finds that sanctions in the ICC have implications for NGOs as well. NGOs will have to comply, intimidating and chilling work to support victims. NGOs help save the lives of millions. Duke University in 2024 finds that over the past several decades, aid dispersed by NGOs increased tenfold, and over 15% of total aid is channeled through NGOs. Our last argument concerns intervention. Unilateral U.S. interventions have been devastating to the global community. DOH in 2023 finds that conflicts with intervention from other states have increased ninefold, with external states amplifying and extending their confrontations. Unfortunately today, Stevenson 23 finds that the U.S. is engaging in more interventions. The U.S. has switched to a force-first approach, which is why De Souza from January found that American exceptionalist narratives maintain a highly interventionist stance. Legal liability, despite Trump's policies, despite appearing isolationist, will continue the interventionist and exceptionalist trajectory. But thankfully, Quote 24 finds that if the United States joined the ICC, it would encourage us to make more careful choices when it comes to military force. Legal liability encourages careful consideration of the human and financial costs of war. It would encourage justifying the intervention under the ICC. And under the ICC, wars like Iraq could have involved fewer civilian deaths. And ICC membership would pressure the United States to avoid fighting unnecessary wars. Joining the ICC and creating a system of accountability for the United States actions would save millions of lives. The Bond Foundation in 2024 concludes that U.S. interventions abroad, when it violates international law, have resulted in 23 million deaths.
Really quickly, sorry, I just found this. Can ICD stem from January evidence about the link between ICCs and NGOs?
They're not, man.
Oh, shoot, my bad. I didn't see that evidence as well. Never mind, you're good. Alright, I'm good.
Everybody good? Okay. While it might look good on paper, the ICC is structurally ineffective. The board in 2023 explained the ICC's transparency has been defective. Trials take place behind closed doors and investigations take years, increasing the perception that the court is biased and politicized. Because affirming is betting with the bad hand, Farhan and I negate today's resolution. Our first argument concerns a counterproductive court. The ICC has been ineffective from the start. Wilkes-Hurst in 2016 finds that the court's proceedings are long and cumbersome. In fact, $1.5 billion have been spent, and yet only 3 people have actually been convicted on account of international crimes. In fact, Dursma of the Center for Security Studies in 2020 furthers that when the ICC gets involved, peace is concluded to only 4% of conflicts compared to 25% without ICC intervention. Unfortunately, it takes the role of other regional organizations that can create peace better, as Bosco in 2013 confirms that regional organizations are 7 times more likely to craft an agreement that ceases hostilities. That is because they know the circumstances better and are subsequently better able to execute peace. And rather than subdue conflict, the ICC inflames it. Iraq in 2017 finds that ICC involvement generates incentives for leaders to avoid prosecution and causes conflicts all around the world to be prolonged by 47%. If the U.S. were to join, it would be forced to fund the court, and they probably agree. What Ferragamo in 2024 finds is that ICC funding depends on its member states. If the U.S. joined, it would be required to contribute proportional to its large economy. That's devastating as it cements the global trend toward violence. Dudley in 2018 finds that since 2011, violence has increased 600 times. What international institutions do next is a matter of life and death. Our second argument is humanitarian efforts. The U.S. military is key. Walters in 2024 finds that since World War II, the U.S. military has been the most important provider of humanitarian assistance. Aid organizations rely on the military to deliver aid, repair infrastructure, and secure against criminal organizations. Unfortunately, affirming would discourage military deployments for humanitarian purposes, as Hawley, a senior policy advisor at the Stimson Center, tells us that the United States holds a unique responsibility due to its size and sophistication. It will be heavily scrutinized by the ICC. The fear of being judged by the court will deter the U.S. from deploying 3 forces in a large humanitarian crisis. And this is empirically proven, as Goldsmith, a Harvard law professor, finds that the U.S. threatened to pull out of peacekeeping missions unless they received immunity before the ICC. Moreover, it will be even harder to propose humanitarian aid missions in the first place. As Goldsmith continues, that it will be hard to generate domestic support when there is a threat of liability, especially after Trump threatened to cut U.S. aid, one of the largest humanitarian aid efforts the U.S. has propagated. Moreover, the lengthy oversight process would hamper disaster. In addition, the effectiveness of the commission would also decline. All continue. The U.S. military actions involve thousands of discussions, decisions, and classified documents. With ICC scrutiny, the U.S. would have to decrease pure power, investigations, and firepower. Moreover, the lengthy oversight process would hamper disaster response time. Delayed humanitarian response time because there is massive ambiguity surrounding what constitutes a vital or non-vital mission. Indeed, what Liu in 2021 corroborates is that the ICC takes many, many years, causing a discrepancy between justice and peaceability. And it isn't just about the possibility for evaluation, as Hawley finds the perception of the court is enough to cause military leaders to second-guess their actions and destroy the confidence of those who support it. Altogether, acceding to the Rome Statute would significantly hurt humanitarian efforts. That's devastating, as what USA 2024 finds is that in just 1 year alone, the U.S. helped 82 million women and children access essential health services. That's what we did.
Regional actors are more effective. but no part in case says that the ICC involvement in a conflict actually prevents the regional actors from solving.
It's a general part. Our evidence finds that compared to third-party organizations, the ICC is 7 times more effective.
Yeah, but that doesn't say that they actually stop the conflict.
That applies to the ICC because the ICC
No,
is involved in
I know that international.
You've asked like 3 follow-ups. You talk about NGOs in your second argument. Why does funding the court mean that money will not go to NGOs? Or why are NGOs?
Yeah. So NGOs work with the court in prosecution with a lot of different Yeah, well, I'm gonna get to it. So the argument we're making is that one, NGOs are a group that disperse aid to areas in conflict, and i.e. these areas in conflict are like parallel to the areas in conflict that the ICC is trying to negotiate peace or investigate leaders in. For example, I'm getting to it. For example, in Gaza, right, NGOs are giving aid and the ICC is investigating Israel genocide. So NGOs work with the court, and because their workers are directly in the conflict, they work with the court to aid them in telling them what goes on in the conflict and how it's actually panning out. And with the sanctions, I'm going to answer.
You're like going on like a long
Well, because
mutually to confirm, NGOs are mutually exclusive with the ICC. They have to work together and can't work together, or can't not work together.
Well, it's just saying that they do work together right now, and that's why when sanctions pass for the ICC.
No.
Okay, can I just finish talking before you interrupt me?
I mean, you can continue.
Okay, sure. I'll have a question. Let's talk about PKOs. How come other countries, i.e. the UK, can still deliver a relatively fast response time in PKOs, i.e. in like Sierra Leone or in West Africa?
Because 2 things. Number one, the U.S. is a massive military, massive superpower in the world. Our evidence finds that unlike other countries, the U.S. has renewed scrutiny over it, which is why in 2003, our evidence finds the U.S. threatened to pull out of key peacekeepers of the ICC. So we can analyze other countries, but we say in specific to the after that is the U.S. And the second thing is that now is what our evidence finds is that because Trump is president, he's uniquely trying to pull out of areas, i.e. he's trying to cut U.S. aid, one of the largest humanitarian aid efforts, and we say that's conducive to also you asked, I knew that we get for the last question. Let's talk about the argument of intervention. Where is the U.S. intervening?
U.S. is intervening in the past few years, 5 years, 10 years, Libya, Somalia, Uganda, Congo, Iraq, Afghanistan, and across other places. Our evidence finds that was 10 plus years ago. Our evidence finds holistically that the United States interventions have been 1, extremely common and under the Trump presidency, and 2, 9 times more common in the past 10 years.
Trump said in the executive order that also said he would cut sanctions.
What's up?
He said that pull out of many million countries.
Yeah, so that is a response to our argument that the appearances of isolationism, it actually is in its intervention.
I'll go straight down their case, starting with the overview about how the ICC is ineffective. The thesis of our argument isn't that the ICC is perfect. Our argument is that the ICC has worked on a small scale. For example, in conflicts like Uganda, Libya, etc. The reason why the ICC has worked is because it holds leaders to a level of accountability. It sets a framework for the way that they function, which is why on the global scale, our argument is that while it may have worked on a small scale, we should be expanding this justice system globally. They say that the reason that we worsen conflict is that there's going to be more leaders that are going to be putting out all their troops. But this is very short term. Their own DERSMA evidence concludes the fact that A, this is correlation, not causation, and second, the fact that this is all really short term. What our 420 evidence analyzes is the fact that in the long term, what ends up happening is that conflict duration actually ends up getting shortened. Deaths end up decreasing by 57%, and that's a tangible number that you can vote on because there's real people getting saved. Second, They assume that the U.S. joining the ICC means that regional organizations disappear. But I urge you to look through the case and look for one piece of evidence that says that the U.S. joining means that regional organizations can no longer exist. Because that's not the case. Porok doesn't say this. None of their evidence actually says this. What actually is the case is that the ICC works with regional organizations in contingency. For example, the ICC works with organizations like the AU to establish better standards for collaboration, increasing accountability, and promoting more justice and more peace. Moreover, we would argue that you can turn this because there's more accountability for things like regional organizations that are currently inciting more things like conflict. They then argue that there's going to be funding for the court. We would argue that there's no reason as to why this is a bad thing. They have to win the fact that the court and the ICC on balance is actually lacking things like fundamentally. Our argument is that the lack of enforcement and the lack of funding is solved by the U.S. joining. They make this argument that the ICC has been ineffective, but what their authors and their own evidence concludes is the fact that it's because of a lack of funding, it's because of a lack of enforcement, and it's because of a lack of a global superpower that it's failing right now. Lastly, their own Mulaney 18 evidence makes my last response for me. It says at the end that reinvigorating global accountability can prevent things like genocide and mass atrocities. Their evidence talks holistically about violence increasing, but it highlights the fact that affirming and voting for the ICC is the solution to accountability. Moreover, we would argue that accountability is the reason why criminals think that, they're not going to be, for example, criminals are not going to be putting on their seatbelt when the police officer catches them. They're putting on their seatbelt before they get caught. Our argument is that accountability on balance increases before they commit these crimes in the first place, which is why our argument is a long-term argument. Let's go to their arguments about humanitarian aid. The first argument that we're going to make is that PKOs and peacekeeping operations that they talk about are ineffective right now because of a lack of accountability. That's why empirically, in organizations like the UN and the United States, peacekeeping operations have actually lengthened the duration of conflict. But what our evidence indicates is that there's no reason why the U.S. stops giving things like humanitarian aid that ends up help-solving the conflict. Our argument is just that legitimacy of U.S. interventions ends up improving per our Quo 24 evidence that finds that because the U.S. is then forced to justify their interventions in front of the criminal court, they can then justify to the international community that our peacekeeping operations are keeping peace and not permitting violence. Lastly, we would argue that violence through things like violent intervention isn't the only solution. Our James 23 evidence finds that the U.S. actually decision-making is skewed in the status quo, and successful conflict solvency could have happened without things like intervention, and with more peace and less violence. Our argument is that the U.S. is more likely to come to the table to solve conflict. They're more likely to give things like aid if they have more accountability on things like interventions. They then argue that there's going to be more, that's time.
Can I call for a couple of things?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Can I see that it worked in Uganda and Libya?
Yeah.
And then I also want to see the 57% decrease in deaths.
That's Ford, it's in case.
That's the same part. I'll send it.
Yeah, can you just tell me what part of Ford says that?
Yes.
And after we get that, we'll start, right? Cool. Well, you know when we get it. Alright, let me just open up the... Okay, actually, alright. I'm good. Starting now. Seconds. So we have 2:34. Just for clarity, I'm Quad on the second speaker for Lincoln Sudbury.
I'll be defending my arguments, what you just heard, and I'll attack your arguments. Is that cool with everyone? Awesome. Start the time. Now, they start their speech by telling you that the ICC isn't perfect. That's true, but they're never going to be able to prove that it gets better. Rather, when you put the US in this organization, everything gets worse. They just cite these cherry-picked examples of how in Uganda and Libya the ICC was good, but holistically, they have terminally conceded that the ICC makes conflict worse. What ProRock tells you is that when the ICC investigates situations, it forces war criminals into hiding. But why that matters is because when the war criminals go into hiding, it's effectively harder for you to catch them, which is why war on net increases by 47% in length. So overall, the ICC is bad, not good, hold the line there. At that point, on our point about regional organizations, they say our evidence is bad. No, it says very specifically that regional organizations are 7 times better at crafting peace agreements because they actually know the region as opposed to some random international arena. At that point, you know that there's no point investing billions of dollars into the second place solution of the ICC. But then, they say that death decreased by 57%, but their evidence in the study that it's citing is quite literally terrible. It has very weak correlation, and there were other policy actions at the time that negate the result. Then, they say that when the US joins, there's more accountability for these regional organizations that incite conflict. Where have they read evidence saying regional organizations incite conflict? If anything, regional organizations solve the conflict, the ICC pushes them out, and the ICC is the one that makes things worse. Then, they talk about how we need a global superpower and how the ICC needs funding and accountability. But we're going to contend that none of these arguments matter. Because why do we need the US to join the ICC? If there's more funding, there's just going to be more investigations, which on net increases war. Then, on our second argument on humanitarian aid, top shelf, they have misunderstood our argument. It is not peacekeeping, it is US troops being sent to conflicts to deliver humanitarian aid. Hold the line there, none of their responses matter. More importantly, we talk about peacekeeping because it's just an empiric. In 2003, when the US was under the jurisdiction of the ICC, it threatened to pull out peacekeeping troops, which shows the US fears its mandate. At that point, let's get on to their arguments. At the top, on their forward evidence saying that the ICC works, it doesn't. Another piece of evidence that is very specific. Shepard in 2009 finds that when the ICC investigated al-Bashir in Sudan, it only angered al-Bashir because he saw the ICC was investigating him, which caused him to go and commit more atrocities. So even in the specific conflicts they want to talk about, the ICC makes things worse. On their first argument on legitimacy, question yourself. Question this. What does legitimacy mean? Why does the ICC need legitimacy, and why does it matter? War criminals are still going to be committing atrocities if the ICC just has more legitimacy. It doesn't make sense. On Hortnagel, their evidence is also terrible. It literally concedes that after the ICC took action in the conflict, civilian casualties increased by 4 times. And when civilian casualties did decrease, it was because of other actions. Their evidence is bad. On their second argument on sanctions, first, Trump sanctioned the ICC in 2016. We didn't see any of their arguments trigger. Moreover, in the status quo, ASM 25 finds that the European Union has set up a separate financial system that allows the ICC to get out of the US's sanctions. There is no impact on their argument. On NGOs, their impact is really silly. They're just assuming that every single NGO is allied with the ICC. That's not true. We contend that most NGOs aren't partnering with the ICC, and they also haven't told you why they're partnering with the ICC. It's not a great argument. On intervention, they say that when the US joins the ICC, it's going to encourage the US to make more careful decisions. Yeah, but that strengthens our second contention on humanitarian aid, because when it forces the US to be careful, it forces them to be so careful to the point where it's much harder to actually propose humanitarian mission aids in the first place, which means this bolsters our argument. But more importantly, on this general idea of intervention, Garner 14 finds in a holistic meta-study that across all US interventions, they have on net been good, increasing GDP and democracy. And that matters because if you increase GDP, you increase the economic welfare for all people in the region, which is a long-term impact. And also, obviously when the US intervenes in active conflicts, lives are going to be lost. That doesn't mean intervention is bad. Okay. Are you good for costs?
Can you name me one leader that went into hiding after the ICC issued arrest?
Our correct
for example, conflicts in Africa. I mean, you can read the prorogue
Conflicts in
evidence.
Africa.
Wait, can you let me finish? The prorogue evidence analyzes all ICC interventions. Obviously, I can't be like, oh, in this specific part of the DRC, it was successful, or like, we saw this result. But what I can tell you is that the evidence is holistic, and it analyzes all interventions and finds that, on average, war is lengthened by 47%.
Wait, your
Can I
word-
take the question?
No. But your warrant is saying that leaders are going to go into hiding after being arrested by the ICC.
That's not true.
That is bar for bar what you read for me in rebuttal.
That is not true. Our evidence analyzes that when the ICC investigates these war criminals, it doesn't arrest them. The war criminals are like, oh, the ICC.
And they go into hiding. So name me one leader that went to hiding.
You're not letting me answer your question. Our prorogue evidence says that when the ICC investigates, these war criminals go into hiding. It's harder for the ICC and other actors to then catch them, which is why they can continue directing all of their other inferior forces to go and continue.
Name me a leader that went into hiding.
I told you, I don't know specifically. My prorogue evidence is a holistic study.
Okay, well,
Can I have a question?
Yeah.
Let's talk about NGOs. Can you quantify for me how many NGOs are working with the ICC and why?
Yeah, I can list you a few. For example, things like Amnesty International, human rights
What are they
organizations
doing?
in
Why are
Palestine.
they relying on the ICC?
Because they're connected to the court. What happens is that when the ICC is connected to NGOs, and they're connected because of things like the NGOs support the ICC, support the court, when the US sanctions the ICC, it also cuts up funding for the NGOs.
That's really funny though, because you're telling me that the NGO supports the ICC. So my question is, if the ICC's efficacy is decked, how does that affect the NGOs? The NGOs are benefiting them, not the other way around. So
No.
what's your argument?
It's both ways. Also the fact that when we sanction the ICC, we cut off funding from things like NGOs because they are
How?
directly tied to the court. I'll get there, don't worry. Because they're directly tied to the court, it means that these NGOs are going to receive significantly less funding, and that's the linkage to our
Just
argument.
really
But
quickly.
can I have a question?
Can I, or sure, yeah. We'll
Alright, so Al-Bashir went into hiding.
Sure.
What happened in Sudan?
No. There's two different scenarios. So there's either two things that can happen, and all like the Shepard evidence analyzes that in Sudan, for example, the ICC's intervention was really bad because when they tried to investigate al-Bashir, he's a rogue actor. He was like, oh, they're trying to prosecute me, and so he got really angry and he started cutting off vital aid from humanitarian NGOs, and he also started killing more civilians.
Humanitarian NGOs?
That's what our evidence analyzes.
What happened in the long term after he went into hiding? What happened in Sudan?
No.
Did
In
conflict
Sudan,
increase or
wait,
decrease?
in Sudan he didn't go into hiding. So this
Yes,
is the
he
problem.
did, because when the ICC,
What evidence says that?
You can't tell me which leader went into hiding. I'm telling you that al-Bashir went into hiding
But you're just
after the
asserting that.
ICC issued an arrest warrant.
What evidence
That's
says he
weird.
went into hiding?
It's when the ICC issued an arrest warrant on al-Bashir, he went into
That
hiding,
is
and that's why.
absolutely not true. When the ICC
I'll
issued
provide
an
the
arrest
evidence
warrant,
later.
al-Bashir got mad and started killing more civilians.
No. What ended up happening is that in
Okay,
the long
sure.
term, after going into
Process
hiding,
over. Can you
deaths
just send me that
decreased
evidence?
57%.
Oh, can you send me where that evidence talks about al-Bashir? Appreciate it.
Can you send that in there and
Joe, let's see. Go ahead. This week's a lot of clarification. I got it. Are y'all taking prep, by the way?
Nah, she's fine with that.
The journal specifically that you sent.
It's in your evidence. It's in
Can you just send me the part that says it?
Very gory.
Like specifically about al-Bashir. Can you send it?
Wait, yes.
Can you guys just send me the part now? Okay, actually, we'll take my
Are we good or not?
Oh, no, he just wants to see it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, this is hard.
Eight seconds.
Start from,
Or no, we fall.
Okay, we'll start from that. The order is going to be our case when the ICC is a forum of accountability that holds great powers of the United States accountable, which is why the most important argument in this round is our third one of interventions. Currently, the United States has increased interventions by 9 times. In Libya, Somalia, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Haiti, Liberia, all these are places we've intervened in the past few decades. However, by joining the ICC, our quote evidence analyzes that U.S. military interventions and U.S. military leaders would be more careful of the human costs of war, and they would have to justify the intervention first and justify the means of intervention. Our argument is not that all U.S. interventions are bad, but those that killed more lives than they saved should have happened. Wars like Iraq might not have been justified under the ICC, and even if it was justified, it would have led to less civilian deaths, which is why it would have increased the quality of the intervention and the effectiveness. Which is why the Bond Foundation concludes that 23 million lives have been cost due to politically driven, unjustified U.S. interventions that the ICC could have prevented. Okay, let's go to their responses. They've given you 2 responses. The first is that interventions would decline in the long term, and we would have to take longer to respond to humanitarian crises. One, we'll get to this on their case because this is empirically disproven by other countries who are in the ICC. They can still respond fast, but just with justified interventions. Second, they then say that these interventions are good. But our argument is not that all interventions are bad. Rather, the interventions that kill more lives than they save and use methods like carpet bombing civilians and killing civilians, that are 23 million of them, shouldn't happen. Alright, let's go to the weighing. The first thing you're weighing on is the fact that we have long-term impacts. Our impact is a future solution for the United States military. Their own evidence talks about how the United States military is criticized in its interventions. And our argument is that perceptually, if we were held accountable, more countries would not criticize the U.S. military because they believe that we are already being held accountable. So the criticization and our credibility increases. Which is why it's a prior question to their case, because we're increasing the quality of interventions that we're doing. Our argument is not that interventions disappear, because interventions don't disappear per UK empirics and per France empirics, but the quality of interventions on humanitarian crises becomes more justified and better. Then, let's go to this idea that the ICC is completely ineffective. There's a few responses to this. The first is that they're focused too much on short-term consequences. They've argued that the ICC prolongs conflicts by putting leaders on the front. But one, their jurisprudential evidence concluded that this was a lot of correlation because these conflicts already have been extremely difficult and the ICC just intervenes in harder conflicts. Which is why our Joe and Simmons evidence finds in the long term, which is an analysis of 101 countries done by Harvard, that it actually decreases civilian deaths by 57%. Then, let's go to their second intention of military interventions. There's one response that they just did not respond to a rebuttal. It's the fact that the United States military is not always needed. The James evidence analyzes instances where we could have intervened, but where we didn't intervene. In the database from 1946 to the present day, it found that the United States intervention had little outcome in the change of the humanitarian crisis, but it just killed more lives.
Can I see Dirk's analyzing Proto?
Yeah. Yours was being core, right?
Specifically on Proto.
Specifically on what?
Because you said that there is not evidence, or like you said something about correlation, whatever that is.
Yeah, correlation, yeah.
Yeah. Cool. After we get
Can I
that,
just show it to you?
I'll look at it.
I'll bring it up.
That's all right.
Order is just a quick comparative between our arguments, our argument proper, and their arguments. Don't build a treehouse on a rotten bridge. Even if you implicitly think that the U.S. will stop intervening in certain areas which do not have the ICC, there's still a really compelling reason to vote for the man and keep the status quo. Humanitarian aid efforts facilitated by the military have helped lift 83 million people out of poverty in just 1 year alone. And you really don't know what you're voting for when you vote out. Trump has said he'll follow numerous military interventions, and you don't know what specific interventions will be pulling out of and how many people that will save. Sure, military intervention might be correlated with a large amount of death, but if on net we're saving more people, then our world is more preferable. So even if you buy their arguments, we'd say you should keep the status quo. It's not perfect, but when we have to compare contrasting foreign policy decisions, we would say ours is a little bit more effective. So, what is our argument? Let's clear it up. The U.S. military has been key in delivering humanitarian aid in war-stricken areas. Unfortunately, by subjecting the U.S. to the jurisdiction of the ICC, the fear of prosecution alone would deter the U.S. from sending military troops abroad. This is empirically proven in 2003, an empiric they don't respond to when the U.S. threatened to pull out peacekeepers because of ICC jurisdiction. And the reason is simple. What Goldsmith explains is that with ICC liability, it will be more difficult to propose humanitarian aid missions in the first place, which is something they don't respond to, especially after Trump threatened to cut U.S. aid, one of the largest humanitarian aid efforts the U.S. has been sending. What this means is that even if they're right, that the U.S. stops intervening, if they can't actually pass the bill in the House and the Senate in the first place to pass these humanitarian aid efforts, there's no point in affirming. In fact, our evidence finds that threatening U.S. aid is devastating, as in just 1 year, it provided health care for 82 million women and children. They have a few responses, but they're not very persuasive. The first thing they tell you is this Simmons evidence finding that on net, the ICC has decreased deaths by 57%. What they have not responded to is that their evidence has super weak correlation and is negated by other policy actions, such as countries going into democratization. The countries they cite, Sudan, Libya, Syria, all were in massive points of liberalization, and it wasn't the ICC that decreased these conflicts, but other factors, which is why their evidence has weak policy. But what they have conceded is a Iraq evidence, which does a meta-study of every single ICC intervention and finds that on net, it has actually worsened conflicts by 47% because leaders go into hiding and want to propagate the conflict so they do not want to get prosecuted. That is also a really easy place to vote, even if you don't buy our entire argument on humanitarian aid. With that said, let's go to their argument proper. They say the ICC is a form of accountability to hold the U.S. accountable. However, while it might feel good to try and fix a world that is bad, there are a litany of structural issues within the ICC. So if we can't solve those first, then the affirmative is moot, and we are simply going all in with the bad hand. They say that they have a long-term impact, but our argument is also long-term. The U.S. is going to keep on needing to provide humanitarian aid to conflicts all across the globe. They see U.S. credibility increase, but how does U.S. credibility increase if we stop sending humanitarian aid to places that need it the most? World of negative as well.
Wait, I'll get the branch. Yeah. You had the first question.
Under the ICC, do countries give out aid?
No.
You're saying UK and France give zero humanitarian aid.
But that's not our argument. Our argument is that the U.S. is giving a lot of humanitarian aid right now, but if you affirm, then the distinction between what counts as a vital and non-vital mission is also the perception that the ICC
I get your argument. What I'm saying is there a distinction, in your opinion, between sending healthcare products and sending our troops?
Of course.
Okay, so then how come you say up there how aid provides healthcare, but then all of a sudden all of your evidence about from Foley, Dallas, talks about how troops get withdrawn and troops respond to different.
Yeah, so that's a
There's a couple of things. First, you guys have entirely conceded the link that we hidden in our argument, which is that even if we can't prove that troops are going to be less likely, we can prove that when the U.S. is under the liability of the ICC, it makes it so much harder to even propose humanitarian aid missions in the first place, which means we're still laying access into our impact. And on this idea of troops, the empiric still stands. In 2003, when the U.S. was under the jurisdiction of the ICC, they threatened to pull out troops, so we'd say it's historically accurate.
You got it.
Okay, hold on. Let's go back to
your argument, what places specifically are the U.S. involved in right now militarily?
Well, I mean, I think
Name
there's,
one.
yeah. One, we're saying currently we're in Syria. But
We're currently fighting the war in Syria.
we're not fighting a war in Syria. We have troop placements there and we intervene there. Here, but I think this question doesn't really matter for both sides because one, both of us are arguing. We're both arguing interventions are happening now. Your argument is just that interventions are good. My argument is that interventions
That's
are
not
bad.
true.
Well, then there's no point in all your evidence being about military.
No, our argument is specific to humanitarian.
Okay, so that,
can I
can I have a question then?
Well, I'm just clearing it up because I think you misunderstood.
Okay, wait. If it's about aid, then if you yourself say that Trump has already destroyed our aid program, how can we pass
That's
more
not true. Our argument finds that Trump is advocating to remove aid.
He's already defunded the entire program.
Really
And
quickly,
then
so,
impossible.
really quickly, can I just finish?
Okay, yeah.
So our argument is that the environment, the political environment in which aid is living in right now isn't great. We want to preserve it as much as possible. So when you have this extra layer of liability from the ICC, that makes it so much harder and actually gives that political capital to like stop sending aid, which we'd say is great.
But the reason we talk about troops is because our evidence finds that troops, for example, bring out infrastructure and secure against criminal organizations, which is called the military.
So
district.
that intervention's like fine, it would be justified under the ICC. But
No, it's
interventions
not
that about like
justified because
like giving out infrastructure from troops is completely justified. That's what Quote analyzes.
No,
but then Quote says that carpet bombing villages isn't
Where
justified
does
under
Quote
the
talk
ICC.
about infrastructure?
No, it says that as long as the military intervention doesn't violate ICC laws, i.e. like giving out infrastructure and healthcare from troops isn't in violation of any of their own statutes.
Really quickly, just empirically, why in 2003, when we were under the jurisdiction of the ICC, did we want to pull out peace?
We weren't under the jurisdiction.
We were, and now we're both in
That's
that.
we
probably.
signed it.
We have 26.
Oh,
Oh, sorry, his time was up.
Yeah.
All right.
We'll take a minute.
Okay. I'll start on the way. So comparing our impacts, and then I'll go to my case, and then I'll talk about yours. The first word on your ballot is peace, and you're looking at the weighing first. If we prove to you that every single future intervention improves, we're winning our arguments because it's not just things like humanitarian aid that improves, it's also things like current U.S. interventions that are currently happening in Africa that are improving. And as long as you believe that the U.S. is going to intervene at some point in the future, you're casting your vote for the AF. The reason why we're winning this argument is because it doesn't rely on the idea of effectiveness. It's the idea that the ICC is there, that leaders are held more accountable. This means that we're also outweighed on probability because our evidence and empirics from France and the UK means that these countries still give things like humanitarian aid, they still do things like interventions, but what's true about them is that their interventions are more successful, their interventions are a lot more peaceful, which is why their interventions on balance have been improving in the long term. Overall, if you vote for this, then you're voting for our argument about interventions. The ICC is a form of accountability, which means that we don't have to win that the ICC is effective or not. We just have to win that the ICC exists, which is why when there's more accountability, every single intervention becomes more peaceful because we have to justify it in front of the ICC first. This means that we're saving millions of lives from current interventions and future interventions too. They might go for a Hail Mary that says that hesitation increases, but they have conceded that hesitation doesn't happen because as long as we can prove that our interventions are successful and they're making more peace than violence, you're still voting for us. They say that we're not going to bring up interventions at all, but that's the exact same word as their case. We would argue that they're still going to bring up interventions because military leaders still want to do things like power projection, and UK and France still do interventions, and that bounds their case. But what they lost on legitimacy is the fact that our arguments and our bare evidence are direct indicts to each other. So at best, this argument is a wash because on balance, 420 finds that violence has decreased by 57%. And empirically, in countries and in every example, effectiveness has been proven. Also, they have conceded on humanitarian aid that violence through intervention is not the only solution. James 23 goes cold concede that finds that the United States could have solved the conflicts without things like intervention, without things like their quote-unquote humanitarian aid and peacekeeping operations.
It's just going to be crystallizing the round, starting with the comparative, then our argument, then theirs. Yeah, it should be fine. All right. What are we getting? The affirmative says they want peace, but if you vote for them, that's the last thing you're getting. Our argument is incredibly simple, and they've conceded that it's the most important in this round. Even if they can prove to you that they saved millions of people across decades, that's still a much smaller number than our argument on humanitarian aid. They've conceded that U.S. aid just in 1 year helped 82 million people. So if you want to help more people, you want to institute more peace, you're negating in today's round. But with that, let's go on to and really quickly, they talk about France and the United Kingdom and how that disproves our argument. But literally look at what they're telling you. They say that the UK suddenly started listening. The UK also intervened with us in Iraq. They are literally contradicting history when they're telling you that our argument is false. Don't buy it. That they just say that if we justify our action in front of the ICC, it makes things better. No, our argument is that when you have to justify actions in front of the ICC, A, it takes way longer for humanitarian aid, and B, it just makes it way harder to even propose that aid. With that, what is our argument? It's simple. The US is the #1 deliverer of humanitarian aid in the status quo. When you vote affirmative, you take that away because when the US is subject to the ICC's jurisdiction, what happens is A, it makes it much harder to even propose troop missions in the first place, which is what they've conceded. And B, more importantly, troops stop even going in and delivering aid, which we think is really bad. 1 year, it helped 82 million women and children access healthcare. At the end of the day, their only response is the ICC is good and it decreases conflict by 57%. This is not true. They have conceded that their 57% evidence is negated by other policy actions happening at the same time. For our evidence, holistic finds that the ICC increases conflict by 47%. That's not peace. Don't vote for them. With that, let's finally go to their argument on intervention. The round is over for them when they've conceded the broader argument that holistically, U.S. intervention is increasing GDP. They just say no, you only take away bad intervention. That's not what happens when you join the ICC. Holistically, it gets harder to even intervene anywhere because the ICC is prosecuting all military actions. Look, peace exists in the status quo. Our world is much more preferable. You negate it.